Welcome to the Brattleboro Words Trail podcast.
I'm Tom Bodett, and I live in Dummerston, Vermont, where I have for the last 17 or 18 years. And I'm here to talk about words, what words have done for me, what they mean to me, the power they have had over me. My family was not a literary family. Nobody in my family read. There were 6 kids. We were just a rabble. My dad was a busy mechanical engineer, very much an engineer, heart and soul. And my mom was a, mother of 6 kids and worked as a bank teller. And literature did not really exist in the house. So being in a mob like that, we were always, unconsciously looking for the thing that made us unique. If my brother played football, then darn it, I was going to play something else, and how you do. And I found that being a writer of anything and a reader was my thing. I first began to appreciate the power of words in the 7th grade. I had written a poem for my English class about Thanksgiving, and it was terrible. It started with the line, Thanksgiving, Thanksgiving, and then the Englishmen are here. And of course it rhymed, A-B, A-B, A-B. Everything rhymed in the 7th grade. It was an early form of rap, I think. That's what I'd like to think. My teacher liked it, and she asked if I would be willing to read that in the all-school Thanksgiving sort of gala at the auditorium. Oh boy, that was big time. So I told my mom about it. She was very excited for me. So she dressed me up in my older brother's suit, which was this heavy wool, scratchy suit. And even though he was my older brother, he was about 1.5 inches shorter than me at the time. So this suit, it was like these high waiter pants, and the sleeves came up my wrists. And I walk out on stage in front of 400 of my crummy friends and associates in this ill-fitting suit, sweating buckets into my shoes. And all I had to do was appear, and the audience started laughing, and of course the teachers are going up and down the aisle, whacking ears and things to quiet everyone. And then I delivered, Thanksgiving, Thanksgiving. The Englishmen are here, because of course your voice is going to squeak in a circumstance like that when you're in the middle of your puberty. And the place just started, roaring with laughter, quieted down again. I continued. And each verse of this excruciating 6-verse poem began with Thanksgiving, Thanksgiving. And every time I said it, the audience would roar louder. And before long, the teachers had completely lost control of the auditorium. People were weeping and holding their guts with laughter. And I realized at that moment that it was easier to be a humorist than it was a poet. And I felt a great power over that audience who was absolutely shredding me in that moment. That's when I realized that words have power. And so I carried my writing habit into high school with me, where I continued writing terrible poetry. It was absolutely awful stuff. Just, I can't even hardly describe it except to say Thanksgiving, Thanksgiving is a pretty good indicator of the style I was pursuing. And then I went to college at Michigan State University. I hated college. I was stuck in Michigan, I felt. I wanted to be out west. I wanted to be a mountain man. I was reading Jack Kerouac, and I was reading Jack London, and I just thought the West was where I needed to be. I had this writing professor, Al Drake, who was also a friend and mentor. I went to him and I told him what I wanted to do. And he just looked at me and he said, yeah, I think you should. And so you know where your writing career is at when your favorite writing professor is encouraging you to drop out of school and do something else. But that was exactly what I needed to do, and that was exactly what I did. Left school in the middle of spring term and was out in Ashland, Oregon by early May. By late May, I was in the intensive care unit of Rogue Valley Memorial Hospital, burned over 25% of my body from an electrical accident that I'd walked myself into, and becoming slowly addicted to morphine and learning how to grapple with pain. I didn't write. I was not writing at all. I was totally just living. I never wrote another poem in my life. One of the big changes that happened to me because of that accident is I became fearless. Once you survive something like that, where you've almost been killed, it's kind of like, well, what else can you show me? You've kind of like been through the worst. So I suddenly found myself able and willing to do incredibly dangerous, stupid things, which I enjoyed immensely. I had to go back to Michigan for a short time. I drove cab to make some money. And then before you knew it, I was on my way to Alaska, and I made it there within a year and a month of when I had been electrocuted. Alaska in 1976, it was a wonderland. There was money everywhere, jobs, young people, drinking, fighting. Every single job seemed designed to kill you. I just thrived on it, and I did not write a word. I just started doing stuff. I went logging. I went fishing. I worked in canneries. And then after a few years, I got into construction, first as a laborer, then as a carpenter, and then eventually I became a house builder of my own. I was 23 years old, and this was what Alaska was in the 70s. You could be 23 years old and have a contracting company with 20 people working for you because it's Alaska, and that's what you could do. I lied my way into every single job I ever had. Maybe that's where I learned how to write fiction, because nobody knew anybody in Alaska. Everybody came from somewhere else. And the joke was you could walk down the street and somebody at a building site would hold up a hammer and say, "Hey, kid, what's this?" And you go, "That's a hammer." They say, "You're hired." And the first job I did as an independent contractor was I built an airplane hangar at the Petersburg International Airport, because the guy said, "Hey, I saw you were building a house over there. Have you ever built an airplane hangar?" I said, "Yes, of course. That's all I used to do before I came up here." and so I became a successful building contractor. I made more money than I ever thought I would make, and life was just rolling merrily along, and I was not writing anything. I didn't even feel the urge to write. A few more years on, about probably 8 years into my dry spell, as we'll think of it, I was getting tired of building. The boom in Alaska was over, and so I was kind of in my mind wondering what other options there might be for me. And it was right about then that I decided to quit smoking. And as I was going through those early things you do when you're trying to stop smoking, you're chewing on carrots, you're drumming your fingers, you're doing all this stuff. I wrote this little essay about what I was doing, I think just to keep my hands busy. And I read it and I thought, that's not bad. It was funny and it was kind of cool. And there was a thing in the Anchorage Daily News and their Sunday magazine called We Alaskans. So I sent it up to the newspaper, and the very next weekend, there I was, page 2. And so I thought, well, my literary career has just peaked, And I went down and got extra copies to send to Mom and Aunt Dolly and all of this, and one for the scrapbook, and figuring that was it. That was really fun. And then I get this phone call that very day from a guy I knew who worked at KBBI, the local public radio station. And he said, hey, I read that thing of yours in the paper. That's pretty funny. Would you ever consider doing something like that for the radio? And so I said, yeah, Joe, I might try that. What could I write about? I mean, what do I say? He says, whatever. He says, like, what are you doing tomorrow? I said, well, actually, I'm taking my black Labrador to be castrated in the morning at 9:00. And he said, that sounds like fun. Why don't you write about that? And I did. I took my poor dog down to the vet, and he came home without a rudder, and I wrote about it, the whole thing, the whole sorry experience from the dog's point of view, from my point of view, and I recorded it on the radio. That was the first Tom Bodett piece that ever aired, with these very, insensitive and poorly thought out remarks on my dog, and it was a hit. Everybody loved it. All my friends are calling, Bodett, that was hilarious. And so I did it again. I wrote about halibut fishing. I went fishing with my buddy. And then I wrote about where do the socks in the dryer actually go? And all of this stupid stuff that goes through my head were suddenly material. And I realized that every single thing I did was kind of funny and fun. And it was almost like it changed the entire way I looked at my life. And my life got immediately more interesting to me because it was overlaid with this sort of scrim of language over my actions. Even something like slipping on the ice and falling became material rather than an unfortunate event. And I began to enjoy my life in a way that I hadn't in many years, probably, and I am guessing, since I stopped writing. And I feel like I rediscovered the power that language and words has. It adds meaning to a life when you are inclined to describe it to someone. It's almost as if I didn't exist until I had to put words on it. And so I kept doing it every week on KBBI, and then very quickly, through no effort of my own, they worked their way up through the network. And within 4 months of my first piece of writing in 10 years, I had a piece on the evening news in National Public Radio. And 2 months after that, I had a book contract from Addison Wesley Publishers in Boston to do a collection of these things. And I was a writer like that. I was writing a personal essay every week for 3 years. And I had 2 books of them published. I was a mainstay on All Things Considered, part of their weekly commentator lineup. Advertising people found me. You may have heard of the Motel 6 commercials, which have been, basically the thing that's floated my boat for the last 30 years. And even though I have written hundreds of thousands of words in my lifetime, it turns out that I only needed 7 of them, which is we'll leave the light on for you, because they've out-earned everything else I've done by exponential factors. I'm reluctant to tell this story to struggling writers because I didn't try very hard. I just fell into it. And I'm often asked, as anyone who's, published or in the public eye is, how do you get started? How can I get my stuff on the radio? How can I get published? And the only thing that I can ever say is write all the time and show it to everybody, because you never know quite where the person who's going to make the difference and throw your switch is at. In my case, I found them very quickly. I found that, a couple of very influential people heard my work, and I would say, number one, my friend Joe Gallagher at KVBI. Number two, my friend Corey Flintoff up at Alaska Public Radio. And number three, this producer named Debbie Dane at All Things Considered, who got my reel, listened to it, and said, we got to put this guy on the air. Now, not everyone is going to enjoy that kind of luck, but that is how it happens. You put your stuff out there, you share it with a lot of people, and if it's any good, somebody's going to recognize it and help you out. That's the way it works. After writing personal essays for 3 years, it became very difficult to keep coming up with things that didn't feel contrived. I began to get sick of myself. My life was not as interesting to me anymore because, number one, I was no longer a house builder, hard-drinking Alaska construction nut. I was a writer, and I was spending most of my time in my office, and I was getting boring, even to myself. And so I decided that I would start writing fiction, short stories. And I had an opportunity to do a radio show, kind of a Prairie Home Companion kind of a thing called The End of the Road, which we recorded in front of a live audience for 2 years in Alaska. And the centerpiece of each show, like with Garrison Keillor, was a monologue, basically a short story that I would write every week and read. And that freed me up to do a lot of things that I couldn't do anymore with my personal essays because I could just make it up. And I did that for another 3 or 4 years, and I published 3 books of my fiction, and it was not very good. It was funny, I think. But as far as writing goes, it wasn't very good writing. So I very quickly became disenchanted with fiction writing as well. And I wasn't getting very good reviews. In terms of being recognized by my peers, if you will, that wasn't happening. In fact, even my friend Al Drake, my old writing professor, he was asked by People magazine what he thought of my writing because I had just published my 3rd book. And he said, well, he says, I think he appeals to the kind of people who don't read very much. and he was absolutely right. And I realized that I had a long way to go before that was not going to be true anymore. And it made writing very stressful, and it made it no fun anymore. Even though I restarted my writing with radio, I wouldn't consider that spoken word. I was writing it, and I was reading the writing. It wasn't really very good. And it took me many years of writing for radio and reading for radio to get better at that, but it never got all the way better. And I started this long 10-year process of not being a writer anymore. It was very difficult for me to admit that I didn't like writing. My entire ego and identity at that point was wrapped up in it. Oh, what do you do, Tom? Oh, I'm a writer. Somebody asked me on an airplane, what do you do? Well, on airplanes, I actually tell people I drive a road grader because nobody ever has a follow-up question for that. But that was who I was. You asked what I did, I'm a writer. And I wanted to stop doing that. It took forever for me to let go of being a writer. To make it complete, I had to replace it with something. And 2 things happened that helped me with that. Number one, I began making things out of wood again, and I started making furniture. I found that very satisfying in a way that writing hadn't been in many years. And the other thing that happened was not so long ago, I got invited by the Moth storytelling project in 2011 to do a story at their main stage event at the Flynn Theater in Burlington. It's about 1,400 seats, and I love the Moth. It's true stories told live, no notes. It's a storyteller and a microphone in the middle of the stage. It's like pure story. And I'd always wanted to try it, but I had this fear of working without a script, which had always kept me from doing anything like that. But in the meantime, I had started working with Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me, NPR's weekend news quiz, which is all improv. There's a table there with 3 panelists and Peter Sagal, the host, and an announcer and a live audience. And you just go out there. It's like skydiving. You're just working without a net. And over the few years that I'd done that, I realized that I could do that. Working live in front of an audience was exhilarating, for one thing. And I got the confidence that it was going to be there. Like, don't worry about going out there and not having anything to say. You'll think of something. And it takes a while to get that kind of confidence. And Wait, Wait really helped me with that. And so when the Moth called and asked me if I would be interested in doing a story for them, I said, yes, I would. And they are wonderful editors and they are gifted directors. So I pitched them the story I wanted to tell. It was the story of the electrical accident I had had more than 20 years earlier. As I was running through the story with them, telling them about how I'd, climbed up this power pole and then boom, and then this, and they were going to cut my arm off. And then I was fearless and I went to Alaska and couldn't get enough of adventure. And at some point, as I was telling it, I mentioned this letter that my father had sent me shortly after I got out of the hospital. And my father was not a expressive character. He wasn't a very good father. I mean, I loved him. We all love our dads, right? But I didn't like him. And he had sent this letter praising me for getting through what I had. And he told me in the letter that I had been as brave as any soldier wounded in battle, which was huge. My dad was a World War II veteran and a military sort of, worshiper. And him saying that to me was huge. I recognize now the thing that really changed me about that accident. It wasn't the accident. It was that recognition from my father. But I didn't know it. And it wasn't until I was reading that story back to the producer at the Moth over the phone, and I mentioned that letter, and she let it go by. And then when I was all done, she said, let's go back to that letter from your dad. Your voice kind of caught a little bit when you mentioned it. And I said, yeah, I had never mentioned it before. I don't know that I've ever told anybody about that letter. It surprised me too. And she said, let's look at that. And we ended up making the story about my relationship with my dad, which is something I had never dealt with. I had never talked about. My father had recently passed away within months, and I could not have done that any sooner than that moment. I wasn't ready. I wasn't ready for that kind of honesty. I wasn't ready to be that vulnerable. And I told that story on that stage in Burlington. And when I stood there, and at one moment in the story, I got emotional enough that I had to sort of stop and gather my throat back together. And I realized that that audience, those 1,400 people, were just there for me. Like, I could have probably left the stage and come back and they would have still been waiting for me. I had never felt anything like that in front of a group of people in all my years of performing on stages. There was something primordial happening there. There was something in our DNA that had us in that moment just locked together. This man telling a excruciatingly personal story, and these people connected with it. None of us could look away. All of a sudden, storytelling became my new drug. My relationship with language changed once again, where I realized that what had been missing in my writing all those years was that honesty. It was that absolute put it all out there and let people see you. That was what was missing when I realized that I couldn't write the kind of work that I love to read from other writers. It wasn't so much a lack of talent, certainly that's some of it, but it was a lack of honesty. It was a lack of courage. You've got to put it all out there. There's an unburdening that comes with that when you stop filtering the information you give to other people. It's a joke we use, right? Oh, he has no filter. You shouldn't have a filter when you're creating art because people are going to see through it anyway, but they're not going to see it as clearly, and so it's not going to grab them. That's the kind of writing I was doing previous to that. Oh, I can see there's some, there's maybe some wisdom, some honesty behind all this, but I can't quite reach it. If I'm remembered as a writer, I'm not going to be remembered as a very good writer. If I'm remembered as a storyteller, I'm not going to be remembered as someone who did a lot of it, because I only started doing it in my 50s. I would like to think of myself as a story maker. I think that is the common thread between all of it. It's language, and we're all story makers. I believe our brains are wired to do it. We think in narratives. Our brains force everything into a narrative. And so it's a natural thing for us to do. So what I would like to be remembered as is someone who made some good stories.
This episode of the Brattleboro Words Trail podcast was produced and edited by Sally Seymour. Mastering for the original Brattleboro Words Trail segments was by Guilford Sound. Final podcast editing was by Angelika Pavlovna. Executive producer was me, Lissa Weinman. Don't forget to visit Tom Bodett's new enterprise, the Hatch Space Woodworking School and Gallery, near the corner of Main Street and High Streets in downtown Brattleboro. Thanks for listening, and we look forward to seeing you next month on the Brattleboro Words Trail podcast.